You wake up tomorrow morning, and suddenly 800,000 federal workers aren't getting paychecks. National parks are locked. Your passport application? Frozen. Small business loans? Denied. Veterans benefits? Delayed. This isn't some dystopian fiction. This is what happens when the United States government shuts down. And right now, with November looming on the horizon, millions of Americans are asking the same terrifying question. Are we about to be held hostage again by political warfare in Washington? With President Trump at the center of a brewing storm, rival factions drawing battle lines, and ordinary citizens caught in the crossfire, the countdown to potential chaos has already begun. Stay with me, because what's coming could affect your wallet, your job, and your family in ways you never imagined. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because we're diving deep into the stories that actually matter to your daily life, not just the headlines that flash across your screen for 5 seconds. Today, we need to talk about something that should terrify every single American, regardless of which political team you're cheering for. We're talking about government shutdowns, and more specifically, the very real possibility that we could be heading toward another one as November approaches. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Government shutdowns sound like inside baseball, like something that only affects politicians in fancy suits arguing in marble hallways. But here's the brutal truth. When the government shuts down, it's not the politicians who suffer. It's you. It's your neighbor. It's the single mom working as a TSA agent who suddenly doesn't know how she'll pay rent. It's the veteran waiting for disability benefits that just stop coming. It's the small business owner whose loan approval gets frozen indefinitely. And this time, the stakes are even higher. We're not just talking about routine budget battles. We're talking about a political powder keg involving President Trump, deeply divided Republican and Democratic factions, and a fight over spending priorities that could literally determine whether millions of Americans get paid next month. The tensions are rising. The rhetoric is escalating, and the American people are once again being used as pawns in a game they never asked to play. So buckle up, because we're going to break down exactly what's happening, why November is the danger zone, who's fighting whom over what, and most importantly, how this could hit your bank account harder than you think. Let's get into it. To understand where we are right now, we need to talk about what a government shutdown actually means. Despite what it sounds like, the entire government doesn't just close up shop and go home. What happens is that when Congress fails to pass spending bills to fund federal agencies, those agencies run out of legal authority to spend money. When that happens, they have to cease all non-essential operations. Essential services continue. That means the military keeps operating, air traffic controllers keep working, Social Security checks keep going out, and federal law enforcement continues. But here's the catch that makes this whole situation so cruel. Many of those essential workers have to keep showing up to work without getting paid. They're promised back pay once the shutdown ends, but that doesn't help when the rent is due on the first of the month and your bank account shows zero. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of other federal employees get furloughed, which is a fancy word for being sent home without pay and without certainty about when they'll return. National parks close, which might not sound like a big deal until you realize that communities surrounding those parks depend on tourism dollars for survival. The Small Business Administration stops processing loans. The IRS stops processing refunds, although they'll definitely still expect you to file on time. Scientific research gets halted. Federal courts start running out of money. The ripple effects spread through the economy like cracks in ice. Now let's talk about why November has everyone on edge. The federal government operates on a fiscal year that runs from October 1st through September 30th. Congress is supposed to pass 12 appropriations bills before each new fiscal year begins to fund all the different operations of government. But here's the reality: Congress almost never actually does this on time anymore. Instead, they pass what's called a continuing resolution, which basically means kicking the can down the road and keeping the government funded at current levels for a few more weeks or months while they keep arguing. As we move through the fall, we're approaching critical deadlines. The temporary funding measures that have been keeping the lights on are set to expire. And this is where President Trump enters the picture in a major way. Trump has never been shy about using the threat of a shutdown as leverage. During his previous term, We saw the longest government shutdown in American history, lasting 35 days from December 2018 into January 2019, all centered around funding for a border wall. Federal workers missed multiple paychecks. Families struggled. Food banks set up specifically to help furloughed workers put food on their tables. It was a crisis. Now, with Trump back in office, we're seeing similar patterns emerge. The president has made it crystal clear that he has certain priorities he wants funded, particularly around border security and immigration enforcement. He's drawn red lines about what he will and won't accept in spending bills. And he's shown repeatedly that he's willing to let the government shut down if he doesn't get what he wants, believing that the political pressure will eventually force Congress to cave to his demands. But it's not just Trump versus Democrats anymore. The Republican Party itself is deeply fractured, and this is where things get really complicated. You've got what people call the establishment Republicans, who generally want to find compromise solutions, avoid shutdowns, and keep the government functioning. Then you've got the hard-right faction, sometimes called the Freedom Caucus, who view shutdowns as a legitimate tool to force spending cuts and policy changes. These Republicans argue that the federal government spends too much money, that the debt is out of control, and that sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, even if those eggs are federal workers' paychecks. These internal Republican fights have become incredibly bitter. We've seen Republican speakers of the House struggle to maintain control of their own caucus. We've seen Republicans voting against bills proposed by their own party leadership because those bills don't go far enough in cutting spending. And with the majority in Congress potentially razor-thin depending on the most recent elections, it only takes a handful of rebels to torpedo any spending bill. On the Democratic side, they're dealing with their own challenges. Progressive Democrats want to protect and expand social programs, fight for climate change funding, and defend agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency from budget cuts. More moderate Democrats are worried about political backlash if they're seen as the ones who caused a shutdown. Democratic leadership has to balance keeping their party united while also trying to negotiate with Republicans who may have wildly different priorities. So you've got this three-way standoff: Trump making demands and threatening vetoes, conservative Republicans demanding spending cuts and policy riders, and Democrats trying to protect existing programs and priorities. It's like a game of chicken where three cars are racing toward the same intersection, and nobody wants to be the one who blinks first. Now let's talk about what's actually at stake in these budget fights, because this isn't just about abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. One major battle is over defense spending versus domestic spending. Republicans generally want to increase military budgets while cutting spending on things like education, healthcare programs, and environmental protection. Democrats argue that we need to invest in people at home, not just weapons systems. Finding a compromise that both sides can accept becomes incredibly difficult. Immigration and border security funding is another massive flashpoint. Trump wants billions for border enforcement, detention facilities, and immigration judges. Democrats are willing to provide some funding for border security, but draw lines at what they view as inhumane detention policies or wasteful border wall construction. This single issue has triggered shutdowns before, and it could absolutely do so again. Then there are what are called policy riders provisions that get attached to spending bills that have nothing to do with how much money gets spent, but instead try to change actual policy. For example, a Republican might try to attach a rider that restricts funding for agencies that provide reproductive health services. A Democrat might try to attach a rider protecting environmental regulations. These riders become poison pills that make otherwise acceptable spending bills impossible to pass. Here's where it gets really frustrating for ordinary Americans. The politicians playing this game face very few consequences. Senators and representatives still get paid during a shutdown. They still have their health care. They're not the ones worrying about making the mortgage payment or buying groceries. The political class is insulated from the pain they're inflicting, which is why they're willing to let these showdowns drag on for weeks. Meanwhile, real people suffer real consequences. During past shutdowns, we've seen federal workers lining up at food banks. We've seen them taking out high-interest payday loans just to cover basic expenses. We've seen families' savings wiped out. We've seen federal contractors who don't get back pay at all. When the shutdown ends, they just lose that income permanently. We've seen small businesses near closed national parks go under because tourists couldn't visit. The economic damage ripples outward in ways that are hard to calculate but very real to experience. And it's not just federal workers. If you're waiting for a Small Business Administration loan approval, that gets frozen. If you're trying to buy a house and need income verification from the IRS, good luck. If you need a passport processed for an upcoming trip, you might be out of luck. If you're a researcher depending on federal grants, your work stops. If your company does business with federal agencies, your contracts and payments get delayed. The interconnectedness of the federal government with the broader economy means that shutdowns affect far more people than most realize. There's also a cost that's harder to measure but incredibly important: the erosion of trust in government institutions. When Americans see their government unable to perform the most basic function of keeping itself running, when they see politicians using federal workers as hostages in political negotiations, when they see essential services disrupted because of partisan fighting, it breeds cynicism and disengagement. It makes people feel like the system is broken beyond repair, and maybe most dangerously, it makes people stop paying attention altogether because they feel powerless to change anything. So what can actually be done to prevent or end a shutdown? Theoretically, it's simple. Congress needs to pass spending bills, and the president needs to sign them. But getting there requires compromise, and in today's political environment, politicians on both sides face pressure from their most extreme supporters to never give an inch, to fight every battle to the bitter end, to view any negotiation as betrayal. Some people have proposed reforms to the budget process itself. Ideas include automatic continuing resolutions that would keep the government funded at current levels if new appropriations aren't passed, essentially taking the shutdown weapon off the table entirely. Others have suggested that members of Congress shouldn't get paid during shutdowns they've caused. Some have called for better planning and longer-term budgeting, so we're not constantly lurching from crisis to crisis. But implementing any of these reforms requires Congress to act, which brings us right back to the dysfunction that causes shutdowns in the first place. As November approaches, and these budget deadlines loom, if you're a federal worker, now is the time to shore up your emergency savings if possible, understand what resources are available to you during a shutdown, and know your rights. If you're a business that depends on federal contracts or customers who depend on federal income, you need contingency plans. If you have appointments or applications with federal agencies, expect potential delays. But beyond personal preparation, this is a moment for civic engagement. Contact your representatives in Congress. Let them know that you're watching, that you expect them to do their jobs, and that using government shutdowns as political leverage is unacceptable. Follow what's actually happening in the budget negotiations, not just the sensational headlines. Understand what's being fought over and why, and form your own informed opinions about what priorities matter most. So here's where we stand. November is coming fast. Budget deadlines are approaching, and the political battle lines are already drawn. President Trump has his demands. Republican factions are fighting amongst themselves. Democrats are holding their ground on key priorities. And the American people are once again watching nervously to see if their government will actually keep functioning or if we're heading for another painful shutdown. This isn't about being pro-Trump or anti-Trump, pro-Republican or pro-Democrat. This is about whether we're going to accept a system where ordinary Americans get used as leverage in political fights, where essential services get disrupted because politicians can't find common ground, where the basic function of government becomes a weapon instead of a responsibility. The truth is, government shutdowns are a choice. They're not inevitable natural disasters. They happen because people with power decide to let them happen, believing they'll gain some political advantage or force their opponents to surrender. But the only people who really lose are the citizens who depend on a functioning government, who work for federal agencies, who need services that suddenly disappear, and who watch helplessly as their leaders prioritize political theater over practical governance. As we head into November and these showdowns intensify, stay informed. Hold your representatives accountable, regardless of party. Demand better. Because this pattern of governing by crisis, of using shutdowns as leverage, of treating federal workers and the American people as collateral damage in political wars, it doesn't have to be this way. We deserve better. We deserve a government that can actually govern. That's all for today's video. If you found this breakdown helpful, smash that like button and share this with someone who needs to understand what's really at stake. Subscribe if you haven't already because we'll be following this story closely as events unfold. Drop a comment below and let me know, do you think we're headed for a shutdown? Who do you think will blink first? And what do you think Congress should prioritize in these budget fights? I read all your comments, and I genuinely want to hear your perspectives on this. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and remember that the people have more power than we often realize when we actually choose to use it. I'll see you in the next video.